Hello and welcome to the Mysticast, where you join me, Jack Stafford, student of metaphysics, as I talk to a variety of guests to better understand the teachings given by the masters through the Aetherius Society, the new cosmic religion for the Aquarian Age, incorporating all yogas, Christian mysticism, theosophy, UFOs, and much, much more. Please note, this is an independent program not produced or fact-checked by the Aetherius Society. Today, my guest is the author, Sean Stowell.
Hello.
Oh, now I
How's
can hear
things?
you. Very good, thank you.
Good to meet you. Where are you? Are you in Italy?
I am, yes, yeah.
Whereabouts in Italy are
It,
you?
it's about an hour and a half south of Napoli, kind of opposite the Amalfi Coast.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a really cool place to be. How come you're there?
I was going to show you a ring, but I'm not actually married. But I'm as good as
Almost married. Yeah.
we've got an Italian child, so
All
that
right,
kind of
great.
makes me an honorary citizen in my book. Yeah, I mean, I'm a student of metaphysics. I got into it in India about well, it's pre-COVID, so I was getting on for 3 years ago now, and 4 years, and yeah, I really got into the metaphysical aspects
Mm.
of yoga, and because I thought things like walking on water and levitation, I thought like everyone, I thought it was just allegories. What do you call it? Allegory, and
Yeah,
like
allegorical. Yeah.
yeah, and I didn't really get the science behind it, but now I do understand how you can do these practices. You raise Kundalini, you open chakras. It's metaphysics. It's like next level physics. So I'm
Right.
fully sold on the idea that Dr. Canon had many abilities, and
Mm.
so I was hoping to hear from you because
Yeah.
you're the number one authority on what is quite a
Well, I mean, there are a number of people who've looked at it. I mean, I sort of looked at it from a historic perspective because of his role with Edward VIII. But anyway, so is that the key aspect that you want to talk about?
yeah. I mean, we just chat about it as
Yeah.
if you're around, if you're around for dinner, and
Yeah.
I don't have any questions. I'm just enthusiastic. So maybe you
Yes,
could,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, so for obvious question, why did you write a book about him?
Well, my dad was born on the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man is a small island. It's in the middle of the Irish Sea. So it's a short distance from Ireland and a short distance from England. So it's equidistant and fascinating place because it has its own language, its own culture. My dad spoke Manx, which is a bit like Irish. And he grew up during the Second World War. The British Army took over huge chunks of Man. And it played a big role, a huge role, and a fairly secret role during the Second World War. There was a number of different aspects of the armed forces and MI5, Secret Service were there in sort of hefty numbers, I think, because they were looking after a place that was starting to work on radar. British radar was amongst the first, and it's fascinating that my dad lived opposite this one of the first radar stations in Britain.
Yeah, nowadays you'd be worried about the 5G or the radiation from
Absolutely,
that.
yeah. So he mentioned that after the war, a man called Dr. Alexander Canon came to his school to do a science show, and the science show involved him appearing from behind curtains, dry ice, dramatic music, and he would do a sort of scientific experiment. But he would also mix in levitation, various other things. And he was quite old by then. He had both. He'd lost both his legs because whilst he was a doctor, he didn't diagnose in himself diabetes. So he had two false legs, and very sadly, but the kids didn't know that he was stumbling around because of this. And so my dad has a very strong memory of the kids laughing behind the hand. But this amazing character on stage, in school, dry ice, dramatic music. And so Dad told me about this as a child, but then one day Dad's archivist friend um, wrote him an email and said that MI5 files had just come in about Dr. Canon. So MI5 during the Second World War had been watching Dr. Canon, and so had the police. And so I then got copies of the files. Can you hear the?
No, I don't hear anything. No.
So I got a copy of the file and went through it, and it is absolutely amazing. It's an amazing story of a man claiming to levitate, a man claiming to do all sorts of things, and he was taken seriously. He was taken very seriously by what I then, after a few years looking at the story. Can you hear the Hoover?
No. It's,
No,
it's
okay.
Yeah.
After a few years looking at the story, I did more and more research, and the very top of the British Armed Forces took Dr. Canon very seriously. And there are lots of stories, as you see in my book, there are stories about him being psychically involved in big battles, Second World War battles, most notably off the northern coast of Norway. He claimed he was guiding the British forces when one of the secret coding machine was discovered on a trawler, and that was a major breakthrough in the Second World War. And for all those reasons, Dr. Canon is a massively fascinating character.
Was that the Enigma machine then?
The Enigma machine, one of them. There was a number of them, and this was on a trawler that had been hit by a British torpedo. And as the trawler was sinking, a British commando got on board and went through and grabbed a load of stuff randomly. And he was part of a commando group, two or three groups. And one of those groups, not this particular group, but another group that was involved in an operation elsewhere in the north coast of Norway, was led by a guy called Commander Congreve. Now, Commander Congreve, Geoffrey Congreve, was a establishment ruling class English aristocrat, and he was an amazing character in that he had bought into hook, line, and sinker Dr. Canon's beliefs and claims of levitation. Everything that Dr. Canon said he believed in, apparently Geoffrey Congreve also believed. And he believed that it was possible to detect submarines, and Dr. Canon would say all of this to him, and then Congreve would go to the top brass of the military and say it. And it appears to me that he was taken seriously. Mm-hmm. So Congreve was leading one of these groups, one of these commando groups on the north coast of Norway. And a separate group found one of the Enigma machine code breakers. So once they realized, it took a while for them to realize what they had, but it took, it was an amazing thing for Canon to be able to claim. And Commander Congreve was to Downing Street to meet Churchill, for Churchill to congratulate Congreve. And secretly, Congreve was stood there saying, well, I was psychically guided by Dr. Canon. Mm. So for all of those reasons, it is an amazing story.
Wow. Well, I mean, shouldn't be too surprising because I know the FBI, the CIA, they do use a lot of psychics. There's
absolutely,
you say the X-Files, it looks, writers use these stories because they make for good TV, but they're all based in, there's an element of truth in that. And so,
absolutely. Yeah.
So it's great that you uncovered. Did you ever get to speak to somebody because Dr. Canon was dead before you ever got to speak to him? Did you speak to someone who knew him and got any first hand?
Yes. They split into two groups. some of them took him very seriously, and some of them just laughed at him. And so I met, for instance, his secretary, who said things like that that he would be in one room in his castle on the Isle of Man, a building that was known as his castle. Uh, and this woman, whose name escapes me, she said that he would hear she would hear a crash, and that would be him levitating himself through walls and crashing into another room. You know what I mean? So she had all these stories, and I wanted to laugh, but I didn't, because she fully believed it, and she fully believed that he was a reincarnation of King Henry VIII, and he believed it, and she believed it. But there was, there was other stories like my dad. My dad laughed and laughed, and one of his friends, Doug Sandel, who is an artist who lives in Leeds, he has stories about living in Douglas. At the end of Doug's garden was one of Dr. Canon's grand houses, and he would see Dr. Canon walking patients round, and they were obviously very anxious people who had clear psychological problems. But Dr. Canon would walk them round and round and round and round. And of course, that to Doug, who was then a child, was funny. But what I can see there is patients obviously paying Dr. Canon a lot of money. Whether or not he sort of had any positive outcome, I don't know. But he certainly took over people's, minds in perhaps a good way or a bad way. I don't know. I do think he was way ahead of his time in terms of what he would prescribe for people. In that, folic acid was one main thing. The other thing was folic acid, which is an acid in green vegetables. He believed that clean living, green vegetables were good, and that you didn't have to rely on medicine. You could do yoga, and you could breathe deeply, and you could calm yourself down. And a lot of illness was related to stress. And now, of course, he's absolutely right. We know that to be correct. And back then, that was viewed as sort of out there, eccentric, and a deviant. And he was definitely a deviant. And of course, if you go around saying that you can levitate yourself over the Himalayas with your porters and servants, as he did in one of his books published in 1943, that was incidentally republished, I think, 26 times up until 1948. So he had fans. He found fans across the world. And whilst a lot of it was a load of nonsense, a major part of it was really interestingly forward thinking.
Yeah, because I'd have heard he was a bit doing healing. He was doing.
Yeah, he would do anything if he could. I think he made a hell of a lot of money, and he claimed that he could heal with thought and with his hands and so on. Whether or not he did achieve that, of course, is doubtful, I would say. But an amazing character, very much of his time, because I think, a few decades ago, people were ready to believe this stuff. And I think the numbers of people who believe in it now are minimal or small, but at the same time, as you say, the X-Files falls on willing ears and willing eyes.
Well, I'm coming from the point that it's completely believable. It's like, Reiki, you bring down energy into the body, and you send it out through your hands, and you can heal. And it's just, it's metaphysics. So it's obviously, it's not in your everyday thing, but healing with the hands is the laying on of hands is so. Well, maybe we go to the beginning then, because he learned these skills. I think went to Tibet and India,
Yeah.
and he had training. So somebody trained him. He's not.
Yes.
He didn't
He was
claim
on the
to be
Silk
a.
Road. He traveled the Silk Road.
So where did he first get? Where did he claim to get his initiation from? He met.
I think, well, he fought in the First World War. And
Okay.
after the First World War, was trained in medicine at Leeds University. So, I think he had just happened to have an opportunity to travel, and he went to Vienna. He studied at Vienna. I don't know how he funded it, whether or not his father funded him or not. That might have been the way he did it. But he certainly, once he got into this way of thinking, there was no turning back in terms of making money and being able to find fellow supporters. So he went to Vienna. He studied in the university around the time when Jung and Freud were very much of the moment, and he was able to, I think, combine his own Christian upbringing, because his father was a preacher, with interesting ideas, and there was a sort of melting pot of ideas that then took him to Hong Kong. So I think, worked
This was
for the
back in the
British
day. I mean, this was
consul.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
This is
the
swashbuckling stuff. No, I mean,
the 1930s were very much an era of new thinking, hippie thinking. You know, post First World War, there's a lot of death around and a lot of thinking about what is afterlife, and
the
much
spiritualists would be
beyond.
like,
Yeah, spiritualism, very much so. So once he was in Hong Kong, he was able to travel the Silk, go along the Silk Road, go along that route, and find very similar. I mean, he was 30 years ahead of the Beatles. You know what I mean?
yeah.
That's how I would summarize it. And did very well out of it.
And so, when did he go after that? Did he go into Tibet? Did he go to a monastery? Did he do any
I
be a
don't know about the
master?
detail of that, because the files don't actually tell us much. His books, they're probably in his books, and his books I found very difficult to read because I just didn't understand the context of what I think they were published and republished because they were very much, people wanted to believe it.
Hmm.
And I always struggled to read the text because they're very thick. They're like it's like a sort of chat with mystics and sort of various
Oh,
sages.
they're hard to go through, some of these books.
You know what I mean?
Have you read
I don't know how.
Madame
Eh?
Blavatsky, and you know Madame Blavatsky and
Yes, I've
The
heard of
Secret
that.
Doctrines?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've heard of it. Yeah, yeah,
heavy going, heavy stuff.
heavy going stuff. And I'm not built of the correct sort of. It's my brain is too sort of
Sure.
splitty.
Yeah,
I can't
horses for
concentrate on
courses. Yeah.
it. So I don't actually know the detail. I do know the detail of his movements in the 1930s and 40s and 50s in the UK because he was watched. You know what I mean? He was watched
Mm-mm.
by the Secret Service, and those files tell us a lot about who were his clientele and who was bankrolling him. There was a guy called George Drummond, Captain George Drummond, who was a really interesting character. He is an absolutely fascinating character in that he was very, very close to the royals, and it is him who opened the door to Edward VIII.
Wow.
So,
The
Edward
king,
VIII,
the famous,
yeah,
abdicated. Was it Wallace
abdicated
Simpson?
for.
Yeah.
So we are told for love, but I think it was for a lot of other things. He was
Sympathizer with the.
a
Depends which
sympathizer
movie you want to see.
with the Nazi movement, but also he had a drink problem. He wasn't the right sort of guy. He wasn't landing the right women. He wasn't having, he wasn't marrying aristocratic women. He was interested in people like Mrs. Simpson, who we are told by FBI files was sexually deviant or, good at sex. I don't know how you describe it, but, and she certainly caught him, and he was willing to be caught and willing to give up the throne for lots of other reasons. And I go into in the book, I put a number of pieces of the jigsaw together, and it is clear from files from a tape that was made in the 1980s of an old man who was involved in the black shirts, the Nazi movement in England in the 1930s. The verdict was that Dr. Canon, our Dr. Canon, was used as a lever to propel Edward VIII from the throne.
So he was a good guy on the good side, or the?
Yeah, I think he was used as a by the British establishment to get rid of Edward VIII, and there were one of a number of levers, and whether or not, obviously, the key lever was Mr. Simpson, but it took the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury a lot of lobbying of Edward, telling him that he wasn't the right person for the throne, and that the British monarchy was close to God, and that if there was dysfunction within that monarchy, dysfunction of a number of kinds, which alcohol, hanging out with the wrong women, not having the right sort of marriage, that the British monarchy couldn't stand for. Over a month, they used a number of people who were within the sort of they were sort of outliers of the monarchy. They were the private secretaries and the prince's private secretary, the archbishop's private secretary, the editor of the Times newspaper, were all in on the plot. And just by a stroke of luck, the Archbishop of Canterbury got to hear about Edward VIII being treated by a quack, in their words, Dr. Canon, for alcoholic problems and other problems. So it was at that point that they were able to communicate with each other and probably tell Edward VIII himself that they're aware that he's talking to a quack. He must be mad. He must be this. He must be that. And I think that played a role in
I can see that.
pressurizing Edward VIII into saying, okay, I give up. Because he would have known that being a Nazi supporter, a supporter of Hitler, was not condoned.
No way.
Even though there were a large number of aristocrats who believed or were sympathetic at the very least.
Blood ties and to the aristocracy.
Yeah.
But I was trying to think which movie I saw where about this king. It wasn't the king's speech, was it? It was another one about the abdication, and they don't mention any of this. I mean, this seems
but it's
another layer,
out.
Airbrushed out. Yeah,
it's airbrushed out, or it was for a long time. It's only in recent years that we've got to understand the scale of what we're talking about, because during one thing that I picked up in my research, can you hear the dog? Max, come sit down again. So, in my research, I read a book by Stephen Durrell, who is an amazing academic, who has got the details about the extent to which the aristocrats supported the Nazi movement. And Oswald Mosley, who was a key fascist black shirt, was apparently in the night before Edward VIII finally said, I'm off. And Oswald Mosley was driving round, drumming up support in the belief that if Edward VIII actually stayed, he would appoint Oswald Mosley as Prime Minister.
Yeah.
So, all these things you don't get to hear as history is written. It's also true to say that the black shirts were standing outside Downing Street, shouting 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, they had a rant, and they wanted to get rid of Baldwin and install Oswald Mosley.
Uh,
And Edward VIII would have been a supporter of that.
Sheesh, how could have?
So
Mm.
if you have suddenly you find out that a mystic occultist, Dr. Canon, is treating Edward VIII, you use that as a lever. You say, hold on a minute, he's not. He's lost his marbles. And that, crucially, what was his name? The editor of the Times at the time had made it clear that he was willing to publish an article. So he didn't need to publish an article about Dr. Canon because Edward had gone. Had he stayed, then the editor of the Times would have published the story.
Gosh, yeah,
It was all there. It was all.
Yeah.
Dr. Canon's role would have become much more evident had Edward stayed a couple more days.
There was this threat of blackmail.
Yeah.
Wow. Could have, yeah. Should be a movie. No, this could be.
Absolutely, it should. And
Yeah.
you know, I've often thought of it of turning my book into a podcast. I've got more research coming.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do a lot. Oh, yeah.
I've got access to a file. I'm just waiting for the government, the culture secretary, to release a file, because the circle, Dr. Canon's circle, expands beyond what I thought was the sort of outer limit, and the extent to which the royal family on the outskirts of this circle is amazing.
So
George VI.
Oh, I'm not a fan of the royal family, I have to say. It's, they've always
They have their place, I suppose.
But yeah, but so what, did he fall out of favor then, or what happened? Because he's obviously
Dr. Canon didn't fall out of favor because he did exactly, or helped exactly, the process that they wanted.
Oh, he's a part of the plan.
Edward VIII had gone, so you know, it was a case of patting him on the back. Had anyone patted him on the and said very quietly to him, "Well done, old chap."
Yes.
Yes.
Go back to the
Well
island.
done, old boy. You helped. Your presence was, helpful. Even if he probably didn't realize, he probably didn't understand the role.
He was probably genuinely helping the king.
Because what had happened just 10 days before Edward VIII stood down, a woman in Suffolk, in a village called Eye, got in touch with the Archbishop of Canterbury's office and said, "Are you aware that someone who called Dr. Alexander Canon is claiming he's treating Edward VIII?" And so the Archbishop of Canterbury did a bit of research and found that she was actually right. She was correct. And so that hence the Archbishop was able to use that as blackmail. So Dr. Canon may not have known quite what about the role that he played, but he certainly kept himself close to the establishment, because he had a clinic on Harley Street, and through the clinic on Harley Street, he was treating the rich and famous. So when it came to the Second World War starting, Dr. Canon moved to the Isle of Man, but following him close by was Captain George Drummond, who was he had owned Drummond's Bank. Drummond's Bank was the royal family's bank.
Wow.
So if you look on the internet, there is a couple of photos of Queen Elizabeth's, a cheque signed by Queen Elizabeth, and it's Drummond's Bank. Captain George Drummond was close friends with George VI and Edward VIII and Elizabeth as well. So he was in. He had owned a house called Pitsford Hall, because, a long story short, police or MI5 called round to Drummond's house to tell him that he had a choice of either going to prison or moving to the Isle of Man to be exiled because
Oh,
of his support for the Nazi movement, or Germany. Let's say the German government as Drummond perceived it at the time.
so Drummond had to move on Alexander.
So Canon had moved to the Isle of Man to get away from the bombs to preserve his Harley Street Kid Clinic. Separately, the man who I think bankrolled Dr. Canon, because George Drummond was a big fan of what Dr. Canon was doing. The man who bankrolled him, George Drummond, happened to be also a supporter of fascism, economic Nazism. He was an anti-Semite, but didn't believe in mass murder.
Right.
So he disappeared off to the Isle of Man. The two, Drummond and Canon, were very closely linked. And I think Canon was made rich through the aristocratic contacts and business that Drummond was able to supply him. So through those contacts, Canon then went on to set up a clinic which was attended by the top brass of the military. And this brings me to what I was starting out at the start of the story. People like Commander Congreve, who was a commando, SAS commando, the origins of the SAS, and James Bond. Fleming was in the same sort of cohort, Ian Fleming. And so that is how Dr. Canon then inveigled his way into the British military. And it was the cassette tape that was made in the mid-1980s of the black shirts, well-connected black shirts. They were then old men who said that Dr. Canon, far from being persona non grata for his role in the Edward VIII debacle, he was then embraced by the British military. And it was people like Dr. Canon that were fostered by Commander Congreve, who was himself very close to Churchill, as was Drummond. George Drummond, not only was he close to royals, but he went to school with Winston Churchill. So, you have this real proximity, close proximity, which is really fascinating.
Yeah.
And having written the book, I often think to myself, am I mad? Did I dream? You know what I mean? Because it's remarkable in how little it's picked up. Possibly because the book is, I don't know, perhaps a little bit disorganized in the way I've written it. There's a bit all over the place because this, as explaining the story,
it's a lot of information to get
It's a lot of different connections.
Yeah.
And I think my brain is a bit too scattery. Actually tell it in a wrong.
You'll sort it out in the screenplay.
Even just telling it now, I think to myself, is that right? And it is absolutely right. You know what I mean?
Well, it's not too. I mean, all these people go to school together. Same in America, don't they? All and they're moving from the corporate world to the. They go to this. They send their kids to the same most expensive schools in the country. So, it's they're all going to these islands to do different things, and it doesn't take much of a there's not much of a leap of the imagination to. But it's so interesting that because I'm taking it from this perspective of that. It's definitely that psychic abilities are, definitely innate in all of us.
Right.
And that, levitation, for example, it's told, I remember one story from a master someone was going in Tibet and they were with their master and they met a man who had learned to walk on water. And it took him 10 years you have to purify the nadis, you have to do a lot of pranayama, a lot of mantra. You have to have very good concentration. And they demonstrated it, and the master said, Well done. You've saved yourself a penny for the ferry. You know, you've wasted your
Mm,
time though. You could have been doing healing or that.
mm, mm.
So it can
Yeah,
be
I mean,
done. You know.
it sounds much like something that, sorry, something that Dr. Canon would have
Mhm.
experienced.
Yeah,
So,
and the
said he would have experienced.
and then I'm a member of the Aetherius Society, which is a spiritual organization in London, and Dr. King, the founder, he prayed so hard sometimes, you know, he levitated. He had left all Brill cream because he had Brill cream on his head, marks across the roof, across his
Mm,
ceiling, and the
mm.
landlady had to come in and whitewash the ceiling. So
But,
you know,
well,
there's many anecdotes of
yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah,
You
yeah,
can see on YouTube some monks levitating too. Just
yes,
so
yeah.
yeah, it's just a matter of it's just metaphysics. It's just beyond
Mm,
our understanding because we're
mm,
you know not able to do it. So it's easy to dismiss things that we can't do. So,
mm.
but and psychic abilities like if you can project astral projection, if you can leave the body and you can walk
That's
around.
what Commander Congreve was very much um, into that. He would exercise with Joyce de Ronda.
Mm.
Now, the de Ronda sisters were Dr. Canon's assistants. And Joyce de Ronda, I mean, they were both in their 20s. They were sisters, and they were called Eleanor and Joyce Robson. But when they came to work for Dr. Canon, they changed their names. And they changed the names to Rhonda de Ronda and Joyce de Ronda.
Sounds
Joyce
like a
was,
group.
yeah,
The Rondas.
absolutely. Sounds like a 70s
Yeah, goo wop.
ABBA tribute. And Joyce was a young, attractive woman who worked at the clinic on the Isle of Man. And then Commander Congreve was many of the, there was loads of top brass in the military that arrived to stay, to have rest, and to learn from Dr. Canon. So it is really amazing to think
Yeah.
the top brass.
These people don't waste their time. I mean, you
At
can
the
you
end
can
of his
laugh at them
garden
and say they were.
was an airstrip. So RAF aerodrome was at the end of his garden, so they could land
Mm.
and then go and stay at what must have been the best and most exotic clinic available. Because if you go to the north coast of the Isle of Man, look at Balmoral Castle. It's really exotic, palm trees, and
Oh
imagine
yeah.
the Deronda sisters looking after you. I mean,
Mm,
cooking
mm,
food. There was all sorts of gossip that my grandma picked up about what would happen at Balmoral Castle
mm,
sexually,
mm.
but also because of the grand food available. It was all gossip that they were Nazis, that they were Nazi supporters, and of course, with people like Drummond hanging around, the gossip was very loud.
Mm.
Um, and the gossip was that German submarines would gather around the north coast of the Isle of Man to receive signals, because of course the Isle of Man was a prison camp as well. So
Really?
there was thousands of German prisoners interned in guest houses and hotels in the Isle of Man. But also there was the 18B internees. So the 18B people were people interned because of their politics. So they were black shirts, they were Nazi supporters. And so in a place called Peel, which was a fishing port, on the north coast, the west coast of the Isle of Man, there was a specific 18B camp, and Dr. Canon was used to, according to John Gaster, the old man black shirt who made the cassette tape in the 1980s. John Gaster said that Canon was used to vet the 18B people, to talk to them and to suss them out. And so gossip got around, and it was said that the 18B people were communicating with submarines,
Mm.
German submarines off the coast of the Isle of Man. So it is amazing, the stories
Yeah.
that were very
You don't know
much.
what to believe then. I mean,
Looking around.
it's
Eh?
difficult. I'm not saying I don't know whose side he was on.
Absolutely. It is very,
So,
very biblically. And I think there are elements of truth in it. But
mm,
I think what has yet to be established is the support for Dr. Canon. It was
mm.
clearly a huge amount of support for
Well,
him,
in the
his
end,
methods,
it,
what he was investigating.
yeah.
But to get back to the original point, Joyce de Ronda had an affair with Commander Congreve. And from his diary, which I read in the National Archives at Kew, his diary shows that they had sex and they would talk in terms of astral projection. And the sex and the success of astral projection were two very much interconnected things, which you can imagine, can't it?
Yeah, that sounds a bit of the dark side to me. I mean, because
Mm.
when you raise Kundalini, the first chakra that opens is the sex chakra. So, and we're there to gain control of Kundalini. So if you dispense the energy, if you fail the test, you ejaculate you're losing you're
Right.
suspending a huge amount of psychic energy. So it's all about retaining and abstaining, and
Yeah.
not even. So I mean, I know that a lot of the dark side do a lot of that stuff on, but I think if you want, it's about control of the body. It's here to,
Mm.
if you want to, leave the physical body, you need to have control of the physical body first. You need to be perfectly still. It's, you got to be immobile. So it's they're kind of contradictory. I mean, immobile sex is not, but yeah. So, but not as a yogi, I can't really comment, but
Mm. Mm.
they do sound a bit contradictory. But I mean, imagine if you can project, and I've heard this from in ancient scriptures, the old battles, the enemy could project into the headquarters of enemy camp, listen to the meetings and then report back. So imagine if you could, it would be enticing for the top brass to think, imagine because I don't know how many people have had, I think it's 1 in 10 people these days have had an out of body experience. You've kind of woken up and you've been out of your body. Have you ever had that experience? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, you have, yeah?
Well, only in terms of dreaming. I thought someone was in the house when I was in the house on my own, and I couldn't move. But that's quite common, isn't it? Where you think that you can hear someone walking around downstairs, but you're just dreaming it. And I have had that experience but I think other people, talk to other people. I don't think that's rare. Not rare.
That you're out of your body and you look down on yourself. Some people have had that.
No, just the fact that I'm aware that I'm dreaming. It's a lot
Yeah.
more simple than that. I've never had anything, an out of body.
Okay, but I think many people have, and
Yeah.
these are kind of spontaneous things. But when when you've had training, like you've been to Tibet or one in the mystery schools, then you can leave the body at will, and that's real freedom. You can go to other realms. You can travel on this realm. Therein lies real. That's you're on the footsteps of real ability then, and psychic. You can see people's auras, so you could tell if they're telling the truth and things like that. And you can, psychic. Can read people's minds. So these are kind of basic psychic abilities that
Yes.
the yogis develop. So if Dr. Canon had done these practices and was, it's obviously, he's not a fraudster in that respect. I mean, he wouldn't get the top brass and all those people to come and people to set it up if these people are not. I mean, you say, oh, it's easy to be. These people could be conned and that with light shows and dry ice. But at the end of the day, everyone trusts their own experiences. You and I, and they don't even trust their friends' advice. Everyone only trusts what I've seen with my own eyes. So they must have had enough to prove to them that he was the real deal. So
Interesting. I mean, yeah. It is, we are very much science-based now, much more than we were. And, the willingness to believe in this sort of thing is much less common now. But I think back in even when I was a kid in the 70s, there was a much greater grey area in the public psyche than there is now.
Mm-mm.
And if you look at the films and books and the popular TV, that really shows that there was a much greater willingness to believe in this stuff.
Well, and if you look at Netflix now, every other show is something, some
Yeah, it is. It is absolutely. Yeah,
some
it
crazy
is.
school where students are getting amazing abilities, or
Yeah, yeah,
there's ghosts, or there's people are
yeah.
so yeah, and
Mm.
anecdotal evidence of UFOs as well is another big area, and so many sightings, and it's if you just if there was evidence for something based on human observation, I mean, yeah, so I'm fully paid up. I mean, I know you're a skeptic, but it's there's enough
Yeah.
evidence for me, in terms of
Yeah.
parallels between everything, and
Mm.
so. But
So, have you had experiences? Would you say that you've had experiences?
no, it's just enough for me, the logic, the argument, because I'm studying with a metaphysical teacher who can, who's doing mantras since he was 3 years old, and so he grew up in a yogic family in America, and he can do, just the way people explain it, that
Mm.
in a he's not in the TV or anything like that. He's just a very quiet guy, but yeah, they don't kind of promote it too much, the real people, just
Yeah.
because it's just a lot to deal with. Who wants to talk to skeptics really? Because if you're talking to a skeptic, it's usually someone who's kind of comfortable in the world. They've got all the answers. They don't need an explanation on anything else. It's
Yeah.
like, you know, pyramids were built 4,000 years ago by men with chisels and hammers, and
Yeah. Shit.
that
Yeah.
that's
Exactly.
that's the way it was. We don't need
There
to
are lots
question.
of unanswered questions. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Mm.
um, but yeah, I mean, I'm got enough to be personally satisfied. I'm not out to convince people, but
No. No.
and I speak to enough people on this show who have their own abilities, and and I feel lucky enough to be in the Aetherius Society, which is from Dr. George King. I'm actually trying to remember how I first heard of Dr. Alexander Canon. I'm not sure. I think it was in a lecture from Dr. King, but I haven't been able to find it. So that's the
Right.
one thing, because how did I hear about him?
Yeah. He's very much not on the radar, on the
No,
popular
it was
radar,
some lecture I heard him about, and I'm trying to find it. It's frustrating for me, but I
because
can't remember.
I mean, when my dad first met my mum, I ended up growing up in Liverpool, but when dad and mum were sort of a young couple in Southport, he went to the library, and dad said that Southport Library was full of Dr. Canon's books.
Really?
Yeah, and so it, it was he was obviously very well known decades ago.
Mm.
I think people obviously disappear into the sort of
Yeah,
the time,
it's
and
also
it,
because of the writing. I mean, those esoteric writings from 100 years ago are not legible to us.
no,
I
absolutely.
can't
I mean, I
wade through it.
found very dense texts and just didn't. I really tried hard, but I just couldn't.
I struggle with Dickens.
Yes.
Shakespeare, forget about it.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I think
I
anyone
was at
like
the back of the
Shakespeare,
class.
anyone like Shakespeare, I think they're just kind of faking it and pretending
Yeah.
they like that. I don't understand. I don't no idea what they're going on about. So
My mum loves Shakespeare and quotes it now and again, man.
yeah, they're just on an intellectual level above you and I. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but no, I mean, going back to Dr. Cannon, I mean, we won the war, the British. You and I, we weren't there, but the British won the war. So he did. You can argue that. If he wanted to bring, if he was against it. What is your personal opinion? Was he a force for good or a force for?
I think he would have done good for the people who believed in him. I think for those who were patients, I think, if say take for example, Edward VIII, he did have a drink problem. He did
Yeah.
smoke too much.
Yeah.
And those two things are known to create sexual dysfunction. And Philip Ziegler, who was a royal biographer, I did an interview with him, and he said um, the sexual dysfunction thing would have been a big issue for Edward
Mm.
because he drank and smoked so much. So,
Right. Yeah.
for those people like Edward VIII who will have suffered problems like that, because obviously, I mean, my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation, they all smoked and they all looked by the time they were 50 like they'd been kippered in a factory.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Those were
it,
bad cigarettes in those days as well. As
yeah,
well.
really heavy duty
Yeah.
ciggies. And so, um, in that regard, because he um, pushed for clean living and eating well and sleeping well and deep breathing, he probably did do a lot of good
Mm. Mm.
because no one else was doing it. Well, I'm sure other people were doing it, but
Mm.
um, you know, if if he will have had a big um, impact if people stuck to what he said. And
Mm.
so when someone has a big impact like that, you do believe them. You go, yeah, God, he's right. Especially if they're a voice in the wilderness.
Yeah. 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 At that time, especially.
Yeah.
Many of these doctors, they don't take care of themselves. Though I've met some really great doctors, and they don't take their own advice or their own medicine. So maybe that's
Yeah,
he,
so true. I
because he
went to
developed
see a
diabetes.
specialist the other day, and he looked like he drank a bottle of red wine every night. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Smoking outside the hospital door. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So
So
what happened? So Doctor Canon, he kind of, I mean, how did he go from that to school performances? I mean,
I think he was past his sell-by date. You know, the end of the Second World War, he would have, you know, he would have had to have fallen back onto his clientele, his rich clientele, that were no longer as dependent as they were because the First World War had come and gone. People had grieved. And I think
mm, mm,
in the 1930s, people needed someone like Dr. Canon to talk positivity and ethereal stuff to help them through the huge numbers of people suffering huge grief. And the Second World War came and went, and people, again, suffering grief. By the sort of 1950s, when my dad was at school, in the middle 1950s, that function that he had was dissipating, and the sort of um, the media world that we're now in was starting to lay roots, and so someone like Cannon would have been laughed at by the school children. And he
yeah,
was eccentric, and he did fall over because terrible diabetes
mm,
and having to lose both his legs. So someone making claims, someone like that just would have been, he was, and the way Dad talked about him when I was a kid was that he was a laughing stock. He was an amazing laughing stock who talked about connections with the royal family. But actually, those connections with the royal family turned out to be true,
mm.
which is amazing.
Maybe that's why they cut him off and just kind of,
Yeah.
retired him because he knew too much, or he just,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, yeah. I can really see that. And also,
Uh,
people.
also, because the Isle of Man was a popular holiday uh, destination, there was people who, I can't remember his name. He was a magic performer who I quote in the book, who lived opposite my dad. Percy, called Percy. Percy was a sort of seaside showman who would do all sorts of tricks, and people either took it seriously or laughed at him. And
Mm,
of
mm,
course, Percy was he. Percy is the one who said to me, Dr. Canon was a great man, but he was up to all sorts, and he would make all sorts of claims. And I don't know why you're looking at him, because he would claim that he was mates with George VI and He was up to all sorts. And I thought, well, right, okay. But there was so much gossip, so many things that connected him to the royals, and it all turned out to be true. But Percy, because of Canon claiming connections with the royals, it, everybody just laughed at it, because why would someone like him have connections with the royal family? And Canon would of course keep his powder dry by not saying, actually, I can prove it, because he didn't.
Well, he should have shut up about it in the first place. But all these people, all these people are human. You know, he probably, you know what his childhood was like, his need for attention and
Yeah.
whatever. I'm not even, I can't judge anyone. I'm not, but I'm just saying, you know, you think these people, oh, because you have a certain psychic ability, it means you're suddenly, as your intelligence goes up and your consciousness, sometimes you can still act like a schmuck and make stupid mistakes and get sick and have fall from grace, you know, because you haven't learned the lessons. You know, you've not really graduated onto the next classroom. You know, it's really to get out of our existence.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Is tough, you know. So yeah, but it's certainly a fascinating story.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
You know, it's a shame we can't actually interview him. But some of his, you know, I've got tapes, reel to reel tapes in my wardrobe in the bedroom, and he talks like this, and and you know, I can see why people laughed at it,
Yeah. Mm.
because and he would his basically his thoughts about life and whatever go on and on and on and on, and he'll have crashes of cymbals in the back,
Mm.
and this whiny violin music in the background, and yeah,
He needs to
even
show that
in the
showmanship.
1950s, people would have said enough.
Yeah, yeah.
No matter how devoted they were, it would
But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was also into
a
the
little
into
tiresome. But
spirituals.
the secretary who I spoke to, she would type. So she would arrive at work, he would pay her a handsome wage, and he would just sit and talk, and she would type. So he would talk about levitating across the Himalayas and being up in the clouds with his servants, and she would type it up, and she believed every word, absolutely every word.
Wow. Maybe you should talk to a medium to try and get his voice to get him to come through. You could,
That's an idea.
you know, maybe you should embrace both sides of the,
Mhm.
you know, the story,
Yeah.
because worth a shot.
Interesting journey.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this has been great, Sean. I really had a great time chatting to you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been good talking to you. Really interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah. So the next
I'm
things are
jealous of the fact that you live in Italy.
yeah.
Yeah.
Whereabouts are
Be
you?
really nice. Eh?
Whereabouts are you?
Currently, York.
Okay, that's nice.
Yeah.
But the weather's a bit.
A lovely place. Lovely place. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm from
Very simple.
I'm from Lincolnshire and Suffolk.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but
Whereabouts are you from in Lincolnshire?
I was born in Lincoln, but then I moved to Suffolk when I was Bury St Edmunds when I was about 11.
Heard of I.
Yeah, oh yeah, I should cycle to it. Yeah,
Did you?
very close by. Yeah, yeah.
Wow, that's amazing coincidence.
Yeah.
Yeah. Donald Ray, R-E-A. Is there anyone that you can think of who lived on there called Ray?
No.
He was the vicar, the local vicar, who spoke to a woman who raised the alarm about Dr Canon and his contact with Edmund VIII.
Mm-mm.
Mm.
No.
Anyway,
No, but so what's next? You gonna work on this?
I want to find out what's in these files that I'm waiting for the Culture Secretary, Michelle Donlan, to release. I don't think she will, but I think part of the answers that you know, about the proximity of Dr. Cannon's clinic. Well, no, actually, these files wouldn't answer them, but they would certainly throw more light onto the status of the people who are 18B internees on the Isle of Man, and then that would tell us a lot more about the importance of Dr. Canon and the role of Dr. Canon, because these files would shine a big light into there, and I don't know why the British government won't release them. To me, it's complete.
Yeah, must be something there.
Everyone involved is long dead.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
all
yeah.
right.
I mean, but the book's called The King Psychic, and people can
Yeah.
get it on Amazon. It's on the
Yes.
Kindle. It's on
Absolutely.
all good booksellers.
Yeah. Well, I think it's sold out in the shop, but it's certainly still available on Amazon. Yeah.
All right. Wonderful.
All right. Nice talking to you.
Take care,
All
mate.
the best.
Bye
Cheers,
bye.
Jim.
Bye
See
bye.
you.